to start. This is the 1903 Winton car driven by Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson, his buddy Sewell Crocker, and their dog Bud, who were the first people in America to drive across the country from coast to coast. It took them like 2 months to make it from northern New England, I think they started in New Hampshire, to San Francisco. There were no road maps to guide them. You basically drove through city maps when you went through a city, and then when you got to the country, you started asking farmers and others to guide you across. And they made this epic journey with much difficulty and railroad cars delivering parts to their cars when they need it. But this is a way to begin the story of the automobile traveler in America. And the first highway across America, appropriately enough for us in Illinois, was called the Lincoln Highway. And it went from New York to San Francisco. It was started by an organization promoting highway travel and identity. It wasn't a government program. And in fact, most rural highways in the early era were part of the Department of Agriculture, because rural highways were considered to be farm roads to get the farmers' stuff to the market. They weren't about travelers, they were about farm supply. And if you ever go to Texas, you still see the designation FM on all their rural signs, and that means farm to market highways. So we embedded this idea of highways in agriculture until we developed a highway department in the middle 20th century. The first highways were named, kind of like railroads, picking names that lined up through a commemorative thing or names that identified the places you were going to connect with. And these names existed well into the mid-1920s. So if you were a highway traveler before 1926, and this is a highway travel map from that era, you might take one of these big named highways. The Lincoln Highway was the most well-known. If you're a Chicagoan or for Detroit, you might have taken the Dixie Highway, traveling from Chicago down to the south. The National Road went across the US, and the National Road is now US 40. Those were some of the big named highways that people were familiar with, but there were hundreds of these various highway organizations promoting their route and travel across the country. The Lincoln Highway is probably the most famous of the early ones, but it disappears in 1926, and the Lincoln Highway Association disappears with it in the 1920s. Illinois, obviously a place on the Lincoln Highway, and here's an image of putting the first concrete on the Lincoln Highway in Illinois, north of Aurora, around 1916. And one of the innovations for technology and a story that connects to Illinois is that Illinois had a really strong highway department. And in 1921, they built an experimental highway, a 2-mile-long highway called the Bates Highway outside Bates, Illinois. And they built this highway of various types of road building construction, thickness of materials, shaving the road, slope of the road, all kinds of different ways. And then they drove heavy trucks up and down it to see what was the best highway material for construction. The site of the Bates Experimental Highway then ended up defining the modern engineering standard in the 1920s for highway building across the country. And in the 1920s, America really took to the road. And across the country, you would see maps like this. So here's a map of Illinois from 1921 with just a few paved routes. And then you see in 1928, the thousands of miles, several thousand miles of now new concrete highways that had been constructed across the state. This was the era of Governor Lynn Small from 1920 to 1928. He campaigned on the slogan, "The Good Roads Governor," and he was basically the first governor to get the combination of the credit card for building highways, which was the motor fuel tax, and the anticipation of the funding that would come from that, and the demand to create highways out of mudways. So you'll see maps like this from all across the country, but Illinois was certainly a leader in the technology of highway construction, the advancement of it. And Lynn Small gets credit for that, among the other things he did as governor in the 20s. Now, this is an example of one of those Illinois roads from the 1930s that were part of that Good Roads movement. They were just simply two, typically 10-foot lanes with sometimes a curb and gutter, almost like a city highway. which they ultimately decided was not a good idea. But this would be modern highway travel circa 1930s. There are some of these old road segments around, and there's actually interesting groups identifying historic highway alignments and road construction technologies, et cetera. This is a part of Old Route 4, which was at one point a part of Route 66 south of Springfield. And this is a really noteworthy part of Old Route 66 south of Springfield near Auburn, Illinois. It's a section of brick paved highway in the country. And this actual section, and it's only about 5 miles long, is actually on the National Register of Historic Places for an early automotive technology highway of brick. And I've been here several times over the years, and I remember the last time I was there, standing by the road, talking about the highway construction issues, and along comes a caravan of people driving their vintage 1960s Ford Mustangs who were on a Route 66 trip across the country. And the Auburn Highway was one of the things they wanted to travel on to get that sound of the brick highway in the countryside. So even things like highway building construction now have their place in history and are attracting people for that visitor experience of the early roadside travel. Now, the naming of roads virtually ended, and in 1926, a uniform system was put in place of numbering highways. So the east-west highways would have even numbers. So Route 80 goes across America horizontally, east to west. In Illinois, Route 55 went north and south, and 57. So basically that idea was set in place in both the interstates and in the regular highway system to give us that idea of the orientation of how roads were going to work. But it wasn't a perfect system because all roads don't necessarily go straight east and west. And one of the ones that didn't work out was Route 66. When they first did the map across America, there was Route 60, which was to be the big cross-country route across the middle. But it went to St. Louis, and at St. Louis, you had Route 60 north going to Chicago and Route 60 east going across to basically Indiana. And they basically said, well, that's not going to work. And so they had a special meeting of the highway department's people from around the country in Springfield, Missouri. And on a designated date, and I don't know the date exactly, they made a compromise and said, well, let's call this Route 66 instead of Route 60. And basically, Route 66 has kind of a birth date of when the officials of the highway departments decided that that would be a separate number for this route that went from Southern California to Chicago. So we've got the highways in place. We've got the growing cars. Let's talk about 3 building types that were popular along the road. And today I'm going to cover sort of gas stations, eateries, and sleeping accommodations. And the first part of my story is the gas station. It's always hard to say what's the first of anything that's sort of ubiquitous. And quite frankly, the first gas station was a hardware store. Because basically you could have a small store, you could put a pump out in front, or you could just sell cans of gasoline. So the first gasoline was being sold for gasoline engines well before it was sold for automobiles. So reality is hardware stores were there, but what makes it a gas station? And the reality is a gas station is a separate building for the sale of petroleum for cars. And generally at first it didn't have repair bays, it was just selling gasoline. And then the other item that's frequently part of it was a canopy, a covering. And this is an example from Detroit from around 1910. And somewhere around 1909, 1910, the first gas stations start to show up in various parts of the cities. This one was outside of a refinery near the Detroit area, but similarly, you would find these in other cities across the country. And it's really hard to pin down and say which one was the first. But this is certainly one of the earliest examples. And now it no longer exists. So there's very few of these early things that survive. There is one gas station in Pennsylvania that can say it goes back to 1909, but the building that's there is not the 1909 building. So where's America's first gas station? I don't think we'll know, but there's a lot of early examples. Now, in terms of gas station architecture, there were the early industrial buildings that are just kind of utilitarian. But many of the people who first owned gas stations lived near cities and high-end residential areas because they were wealthy. So some of the first gas stations that were built to serve wealthy neighborhoods were built in cottage or residential style buildings. This happens to be one from the Pure Oil Company, which has this high sort of steep gable roof and the blue tile. There are variations of this from many other gasoline companies where they built sort of residential style buildings to sell gasoline. And this one has the original building from the teens with the 1930s repair bays at it, as gas stations moved from just being selling gas to also repairing cars. And so this residential style was one of the second popular styles of gasoline stations in the early residential areas. This is a very unusual one. It's in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's a colonial revival style gas station built in the older part of town. And it actually uses the woodwork from a demolished mansion that was built in the 1800s that they then refigured to make it into a gas station. And ironically, it's now the travel headquarters.
Mike, can you unmute yourself? I'm sorry.
Okay, I just unmuted.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So anyway, I hope I didn't lose too much there. But anyway, this early gas station in Charleston, South Carolina was made from the parts of a demolished, architecturally significant but interesting building that then became a gas station. It's now the headquarters for the Preservation Society for Charleston. Now, the gas station game changes immensely in the 1930s when the major gasoline companies started hiring major national architects to basically create new designs for gas stations. And they do so in a kind of modern industrial architectural style. Texaco was one of the leaders. They hired an architect named Walter Darwin Teague to lead their effort, and he created these sort of streamlined modern buildings, oftentimes using panels of glass or metal or porcelain to create this sort of clean sanitary look, advertising the clean restrooms. So this was a big era in the gas station era. For some of you may remember gas stations like this growing up. By the 1960s, the gas station has evolved. This is one of the prototypes by architect Elliot Noyes of what is really the gas station style of today. A big canopy structure over the pumps and a building that's not so much a repair building, but as a convenience store. And I would say this is probably the predominant form of the gas station today. And then somewhere in the 1980s, we started to add basically food service within these, where you get the gas station combination fast food dealership. So you can see how the program of the gas station has now sort of gone back to its origins of a small service building and then the big canopy as really its main architectural feature. But along the road, there's another interesting variation in roadside architecture. And that is a building that's come to be called either the duck or mimic or programmatic architecture. And it's the architecture of a building that looks like something else. And Robert Venturi was an architect from Philadelphia who produced a big book on learning from Las Vegas in the 1970s. And he came up with the idea that there were buildings that were decorated sheds, and that's the modernist building, or the building that he called the duck, where the form of the building is iconic to something. Well, these are some of the funnest buildings on the roadside. Here's the Shell gas station from Asheville, North Carolina, that's built to look like a big Shell, done in the 1920s. This is the big pump in Maryville, Missouri, which was built in the form of a big gasoline pump as the little attendant station. I don't know why my slides keep advancing so quickly, but this is the Hat and Boot gas station outside of Seattle, Washington. And in case you needed to know, one of the boots is men's and the other is the women's room. So these now still survive, although it's no longer used as a gas station, but these have been saved as kind of artifacts of the road. Kind of a funny little one. So that's kind of my quick story on the history of the gas station. Let's move on to food and dining. And if there is a prototype to the architecture of the road, it would be the lunch cart. And early on, outside of many factory buildings, a lunch cart would come along so the factory workers could come out and get a quick thing to eat. It's kind of a portable diner, let us say. So in many ways, the lunch cart is the ancestor to the diner, which could be either a purpose-built or a prefabbed, almost like railroad car building. And this particular model was a prefab with two halves that came together. And the diner came to symbolize in the 1920s through the 1950s, the classic of roadside architecture, sometimes in urban areas, but oftentimes in rural areas. But yes, they often did look like the dining car of a railroad, a streamlined modern. This is an older style from that. But the diner is really kind of a ubiquitous American design. And in many ways, the diner is a great story of preservation success because it comes and it goes across the country, it becomes fashionable, and then it fades. And by the 1980s, there are a lot of fading examples around, and then it revives. And there's a strong diner revival movement. There's a strong group of people that refurbish diners and ship them around the world. And while this is a streamlined diner found in Iowa, there are actually streamlined diners of this now in Germany, where they've imported them from the United States and make them as an iconic American form of food and service and architecture that's a novelty in the German landscape. So the diners become kind of a ubiquitous place, captured in film, in movies, as a version of streamlined architecture for the road that basically is a unique American invention in architecture and food and roadside architecture. This is a very famous one. It's the Empire Diner in New York City. It often served cab drivers on the lower west side. I think it's on 11th Street and 11th Avenue and 22nd Street. And it became a fancy kind of eatery in the 1970s, and the diner revival starts. And basically it went upscale. And at one point they even had a little piano in there for live piano music. So ubiquitous that it was as a piece of roadside architecture, it evolved to being a kind of a successful new kind of theme of eating and survived along, although I don't know its current status today. But the diner had a really great popular revival and is still alive and well. Now, when it comes to franchise architecture and the idea of a single kind of menu item and developing an architectural identity, in many ways, the White Castle chain is America's first version of franchise corporate food architecture. This was the first White Castle in Wichita, Kansas, built in 1921, and it was made out of concrete block that had a rough face to make them look like stone. And that's not a new material. It had been around since the early 20th century. But by doing this top, which is called a crenellated top, and then the little turret, they had the very humble little thing of White Castle as their marketing term, and they started franchising this idea of their small little burger. I know for all of you in the Chicago area, you'll know this well. By the 1970s, they had changed the variety and ways in which they served the White Castle, still making it in this vestigial crenellation using modern materials. This happens to be porcelain enamel, but the white look, the castle form with the crenellation, but still those tiny little sliders. They kept the food thing the same all those years. Which leads me to the White Castle chain wasn't particularly a drive-in at the beginning. It was a fast food service chain as a franchise thing. But then there's the whole idea of the drive-in, the building that is served by the automobile to the automobile for food. It can be indoor dining and outdoor dining. I believe its origins are really strongly oriented towards California, where the climate for year-round outdoor driving and living was best with the climate. But when it comes to the drive-in as a drive-up, we have a claim in Illinois. This is the Made Right restaurant in Springfield, Illinois from 1924. And Made Right is a chain that started in Iowa. And instead of their Made Right wasn't a burger, it was basically kind of a sloppy Joe without the slop, or a loose meat sandwich. So they basically have steamed hamburger with seasonings that they scoop up and put on a bun, but it's not a patty, it's sort of a loose fill. And they serve it with, mustard relish, whatever. So Made Right is a chain that's still around. It's in Iowa primarily. There's some in Illinois. But this one in Springfield, built in 1924, is still in use, and it still has its drive-up window. So this window right in the center here is the drive-up window. And when you drive up, you can be served. And this is the oldest surviving drive-up window in America. It may not be the first, but it's certainly the oldest surviving. So the next time you're down in Springfield, if you want to have a roadside experience and go back in time, drive through the Made Right. I just did it yesterday again in preparation for this story. They're still selling the same product, the Made Right, but they have added vegetarian chili now, so they're updating the menu to some modern taste preferences. Now, California, there's a lot of experimenting going on in the 20s and 30s with this roadside architecture and the drive up. And you can see it's very open. You pull up your car, you walk to the service counter. There's not a lot of indoor dining. You're eating in your car. So this is the ultimate drive-in. Most of these are gone. But here's an interesting one. In 1948, a couple of brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald started their hamburger chain. And this is the first McDonald's. It no longer exists, but it was that California drive up, in this case, an octagonal shaped building with a canopy all around. You pulled up your car, you walked up, and then you bought a hamburger, French fries, or a malt. There were just a limited number of items. They were selling these, and this company was taking off and doing well. And they were buying malt mixers like crazy because they were really selling malts with these. There was a guy in Chicago named Mr. Kroc, and he said, this is a great idea. I'm going to buy one of these franchises. So Ray Kroc got into the business and took it over later. This is the oldest surviving McDonald's in the world. It's in Downey, California. It was designed by architect Stanley Metzen in 1953. And it's in a new kind of architectural style. And it's had a lot of names. The Jetson style, exaggerated modern, Googie, whatever name you want to apply to this. There was a great enthusiasm for futuristic looking buildings in the 1950s for food service. McDonald's got into this. The Golden Arches went on to become successful. And this guy, though, didn't. This is Speedy Burger, kind of a Speedy Alka-Seltzer's cousin. He was the original McDonald mascot. He got replaced by Ronald McDonald, and Speedy Burger kind of went into iconic history as opposed to Ronald McDonald, who's keeping going. This style of architecture has had a variety of names. I like exaggerated modern because there's sort of an enthusiastic to it. One term that's been used is Googie architecture for its kind of roof forms that jut out and circles and arches and parabolas, et cetera, which were very popular in the Los Angeles marketplace and then caught on across the country. And you'll find these examples around. Howard Johnson's got into this with their orange roofs and across the Midwest. Now, McDonald's did something interesting. When Ray Kroc died, they actually built and restored his first McDonald to an exact replica of the first version that he had. Unfortunately, they did this in a floodplain in Des Plaines, and there's been such flooding problems in Des Plaines that they actually dismantled this and took it apart. But they've taken some of the iconic first things and incorporated it into the new McDonald's headquarters building in the west side of Chicago. But if you really want to still experience Googie architecture, drive-in architecture in Chicago, this is the place. Superdog is still doing well. For those of you who know the city, it's at, I think, Devon, and I forget the cross street, but it's way up on the northwest side of the city, not too far from O'Hare Airport. And they still bring it out to your car, you drive in, you can get the curbside service. It is really the best example of this style of architecture in Chicago, still in the same family, and they're doing a great job with this business. And it's not a bad hot dog as hot dogs go. So Chicago has a claim to fame of having the best, one of the best surviving of these exaggerated modern buildings from the 1950s in roadside architecture. Now there's still this iconic building of the building that looks like a fantastic object. Robert Venturi called it the duck style of architecture. And the example that he used was the Big Duck in Long Island. But there are a variety of these across the country. This is the Java Jive in South Tacoma, Washington, that looks like a big coffee pot. So hence the Java Jive, the coffee pot. This is Mammy's Cupboard in Natchez, Mississippi, that it was both a eatery and gas station. But I heard the last time that I caught up on the story here, it was selling tacos. So I don't know what happens when the brands change over time, these businesses change, but it doesn't seem like a taco place to me. And then one of the more famous ones is this, the Tail of the Pup in Los Angeles, a little hot dog vendor machine that looks like a hot dog in a bun. And this kind of reminds me of state fair architecture. Isn't this sort of the thing you'd see when you go to the big county fairs or a state fair? These little things, because they've come kind of popular now at the scale of a trailer that you can pull around. But Tail of the Pup is one of the oldest ones in the Los Angeles area, dating from the 1930s. And the good news about this architecture is it's portable. It can move around. So if you find a good location, you can set up there, but the architecture is really small enough to be movable. But you're moving around, you're feeding your gas in your car, you're feeding yourself, but when you're traveling and on the road, the third thing you need to do is you need a place to stay. And that might be a motel, but there are even things before the motel. And I do find this interesting that the first recorded use of the word motel is from 1926. So it's actually in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first recorded use of it for a motel in California. But before you traveled with the roadside architecture, in the first decades of the 20th century, if you were an intrepid automobile traveler going across the country, you didn't expect to have roadside services. There were hotels in the town, but when you got in the countryside, you might just be going auto camping. And this was a huge rage in the teens to the early 20s, pulling off along the road, camping, and out of the personal auto camping emerged the automobile and the tourist court. And these would be a setup with small cabins set aside. And this is a surviving example that I visited back in the 1980s of a roadside cabin. I'm guessing there's a 2-bedroom version and a 1-bedroom version or a double bed, looking at the size of these things. But it was not uncommon for an entrepreneur along the road to have some kind of store or something and say, I'm going to build some roadside cabins. So the cabin court complex precedes the motel as the roadside architecture accommodation in many rural areas. So cabins, auto camps, tourist supplies, popular in some tourist destinations if you're heading up to Wisconsin, or if you're in the New England and you're heading up into the rural New England areas. These were extremely popular in the 1920s to the 1930s. If you are an Illinois person and you know about our state parks, these 4 state parks all still have little cabin complexes in addition to a state park lodge. Actually, White Pine State Park only has a series of small wooden cabins in the countryside. It doesn't have the larger lodge. Starved Rock, Pere Marquette, and Giant City parks all have a big lodge with dining, and then have these small cabins that you could stay in. So you could get your experience of the rural, rustic nature of the world with the comforts of an enclosure without the problems of camping and having to bring your own camping supplies, tents, etc. So these are actually pretty cool cabin complexes from the 1920s, and the state's been keeping them up very well at these state parks. Now, I mentioned the word motel. This is recorded in the Oxford English Dictionary. The Motel Inn in San Luis Obispo was the first place to call itself a motel. And you see it even the logo there with the M and the H on it. And this was bungalows. It was a bigger accommodation, but it was a motor hotel, a motel. It is no longer extant. As you can see in the image in the lower right, there's one small portion of it that's survived and being propped up as a sort of a memory piece to the origin of the motel in America. So completely hotel services with fireproof bungalows, they advertised. So it was made out of basically concrete block and clay tile to be safe, because that was a big part of the importance of roadside architecture or safety of buildings was fireproof back then. So out of the cabin court complex, you started to see the cabins coming together, first as duplexes being aligned up. And then ultimately, if you just start, you can see how if you hook all these cabins together, you create kind of the ubiquitous form of the early motels, which were often a residential scale of building as a long single use building with just an opening for the doors to the outside, no indoor location, no lobby. In this case, you had a front building and then the cabin court. These were incredibly popular in the 1930s. The Alamo Plaza Court was a chain out of the South. This happens to be an example from Memphis. And there are a variety of these designs for these cabin court complexes across the country. This was one of the more famous ones on Old Route 66 in Marlboro, which is outside St. Louis, Missouri. The Coral Court complex with this streamlined modern design, individual garages, so your car was sort of covered up overnight, your cabin next to it in the modernist style. And this was a series of these duplex cabins around a courtyard complex, about 50 of them, demolished in the 1980s. But this was the most popular form of roadside architecture until the invention of the motel, where you linked it all together. And this happens to be the first Holiday Inn in America in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, this is a picture I took in the 1980s after it was no longer a Holiday Inn. It had been sold off and a different local operator was running it. But this was the first Holiday Inn chain in America, the Holiday Inn started by Mr. Emmons. And it goes on to be obviously one of the larger of the hotel chains. This is one of their iconic starburst neon signs from the 1960s. And these now exist in museums. They're being saved and curated. The Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan has one of these. The American Sign Museum has one of these. So the iconic version of the roadside architecture hotel has survived through artifacts in the way they're preserved. And the building went on to become a much bigger building as a roadside. Now, there are a lot of other kinds of buildings that emerged to serve the car and the marketplace. And I'm not going to get into all the different variations of them today. Clearly, one of them is the drive-in movie theater, which is enjoying a little bit of a revival right now in our COVID era, where you can go outside and see things. So a lot of drive-ins have closed, but they've been given a kind of a burst of reuse again in the last year. And the same goes for some of the older motels. Some people say it's safer to stay in an old motel where you don't have to go into a lobby and an elevator. And so the old motels where you pulled up outside and went directly into your room have actually seen a big increase in business in this last year of COVID, which is kind of an interesting irony of the marketplace. This happens to be one of the oldest car washes in America. I don't think anybody has yet written the book on the definitive history of the car wash building, but I suspect that sometime somebody will. But this was Paul's Car Wash in Detroit, which I visited back in 1989. And, you know, again, inventions of technology to serve the automobile, the car wash structures. So another new type of building that served the automobile commercial marketplace. Now, the story I've told you today comes because I've been very active with this group, the Society for Commercial Archaeology. And in 1988, we had a big conference at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And they did something very interesting. The Henry Ford Museum had been collecting automobiles. Obviously, Ford's first automobile is there. And so they have an automobile-oriented collection. And they have the Greenfield Village, which is buildings representing American history. But they started collecting buildings that represent automobile history. So within the museum now, they have an early Texaco gas station. They have a restored Holiday Inn sign, a restored Holiday Inn room, complete with that little paper strip that goes over the toilet that says sanitize for your protection. I mean, they've gone to exquisite lengths to basically save and do fragments of architecture that tell the story of roadside architecture because they're the story of automobiles and technology in place. So this is an increasingly a phenomenon that local architectural groups, local museums, historical societies are recognizing that the story of the automobile is a big part of the story of the 20th century. and they're integrating their collection policies and interpretation programs to reflect that. I like to talk about the Henry Ford Museum, which has been a leader in that. The American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio, is collecting all kinds of roadside architecture signs. This is their neon hall of glorified neon signs. And you can see that the neon sign was a big part of the American roadside landscape in the 1920s. Well, actually, it starts in the 20s, big in the 1930s and 40s, then sort of fades in the 50s and 60s, and kind of really goes out of fashion by the 70s, and then has a revival starting in the 80s. But every one of these things is a technology that's put to commercial purposes to talk about sales and marketing and the story of what places like. And now they're finding their place in telling our history of what we've done as a culture in the 20th century. And probably one of the most exciting things to me in all of this stuff that's happened is that when the numbering system was established in the 1920s for highways, the people that did roadside, well, basically the groups that promoted named highways thought this was terrible because they said no one is going to care about a route number. And the Lincoln Highway has cachet, the Dixie Highway, but Route 60 or whatever, that just isn't going to take it. Well, boy, would they have been surprised to know how much Route 66 has now become the embodiment of the American automobile experience. Route 66 will turn 100 years old in 1926. Legislation was just signed on December 23rd, 2009 for the National Route 66 Centennial Commission. So basically, under the overview of the National Park Service and their National Trails program, we now have a congressionally mandated Centennial Commission to look at the history of Route 66, the places along it, the stories of its travel. This is my local congressman in Central Illinois, who is one of the sponsors of this, Rodney Davis, there to promote the story of Route 66 as the iconic American highway of the mid-20th century. Obviously, it starts in Chicago, or depending upon your point of view, it starts in California and goes to Chicago. It's all the east-west perspective, but basically from Chicago to Los Angeles, it has become really an international symbol of the story of highway travel. And while Route 66 has not officially been redesignated as the operating number today, the historic route travel is well documented, well marketed, all the states that it go through, and the recognition of this number has gone way beyond anything that anyone who originally traveled the highway would have ever imagined could become so popular. Route 66 songs, Route 66 fashion wear, it has really captured the essence of the story of the roadside architecture. But what else is new? I want to say if there's one new thing that's happening in the research on travel along the road, probably one of the more important things that's happening is all of a sudden there's been a great interest now in the Green Book, which was the Negro traveler's travel book. And it was a guy named Mr. Green who invented it. So that's why it's called the Green Book. He published it. But it would list the places that African Americans, Black Americans could stay at when they traveled, because in the era of Jim Crow and segregation, you couldn't stay everywhere. So there's now a great new interest in documenting this part of the travel experience. What were the places that related to them? I've been looking at this in Illinois, and what's really sad is that most of the places that were identified have actually disappeared. Very few of them are still around and active, and a few more are still there as buildings, but not active. But this is one of the new interesting research topics for roadside architecture and the travel experience is travel for the Black American traveler, where they could stay, what they could do, the accommodations that were made to them. So the story of history never changes. You're always looking at new ways to discover things, to put it in context of its time, and to add to the narrative of why something was once the way it was and how it's evolved, and how that sense of recognition of place can tie into the story of today and building awareness. So that's my story about roadside architecture in brief, with 3 building types, the gas, food, and lodging. I could talk a lot about many more versions of this topic, and very many building topics related to it. But let's start here with your questions. And I thank you for your time today, for coming to this roadside tour. Hillary.
Mike, thank you. Thank you. I just actually put in the chat box. There's a great film called The Green Book, and it's available for streaming on Netflix and Amazon. I highly recommend taking a look at it. It's a very interesting part of our history that probably many of us didn't even realize. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and I will convey them to Mike. I have a question. Why were routes numbered as opposed to just giving names right off the bat?
Well, I think because the first people that started this were not thinking that they were doing this for the whole country. They were starting to promote it from their perspective. And like I said, the very first one was the Lincoln Highway. And if you want to know the antecedent, before this, the names for cross-country travel were coming from railroads. So you'd have the Burlington route, or you'd have a route that was named for the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. So there was a history of naming railroads for the identities they connected to, or the name of the organization of the railroad. So that's probably where it came from. So it took a while before we came up with the numbering system to make it more uniform for travelers. And that happened in 1926.
Susan wants to know if H. Nelson Jackson is a relative.
Not to me. I wish I could claim that. I would love to say that, but unfortunately, I have to say no. That would be.
Go ahead. We have a couple of comments that people remember when gas was 29 cents a gallon. Lots of diners in New York.
Yep. Well, and I think this program helps many of you who grew up and had that experience of the early roadside travel identify with what were the kind of places and what were your memories of that. Travel ephemera has become popular. The picture postcard is part of that era of the travel of the document. A lot of my friends who research roadside architecture collect postcards because that was a part of the combination of your traveling, was to let others know where you traveled from. And motels started giving away free postcards when you went there. So if you're studying motels and hotels, you'll often find postcards available for those. It can be more difficult to find postcards of other kinds of building types that weren't as commercially promoted. But there are people that collect menus from where they've eaten, the foods along the way. So you can take this research to all kinds of enthusiasms. One of my favorites is a group called, there's a group that studies roller coasters as history. They're called ACE, American Coaster Enthusiasts. I'd be a proud member of ACE if I wanted to, kind of have your credits for belonging to a group that looks at something and studies things. So we're pretty good as a culture at pulling together groups that have a similar interest in finding each other. There's even an organization of soda jerks who used to work in the soda fountains and remember those.
We do have another question. Did World War II have an effect on Route 66 travel?
I would say, yeah. Obviously, the gas rationing in World War II limited people's ability to acquire gasoline to do more domestic travel. But I will say that Route 66 prospered immensely, even during the 1930s depression, and even all the businesses that served the roadside architecture business, gas stations, et cetera, did fairly well even in the depression because it was the one essential service that was growing. Even though people had a lot of strapped things, they still had to travel and were doing so. So travel didn't stop in terms of overall, it might have stopped from a recreational standpoint. And that's probably the biggest impact in World War II.
So the people who, before the motels came along, you had those auto camps, which I thought Motel 6 was pretty bad, but that looks far worse. Was there did people sell camping equipment? I mean, did you just set up a blanket? I mean,
auto camping was extremely popular, and like Marshall Fields had a special department for the auto campers in the men's store on Wabash, where you could pick up your travel things. They had adapter kits to go on various types of cars that could make it a tent that attached to your car. So auto camping was extremely popular in the teens before we developed any kind of roadside services in the rural areas. And it was legal to just kind of pull over to a farmer's pasture or something and set up an auto camp. And it's funny, south of Bloomington on Old Route 66, there's a bypass old road, and it's called Cabin Town Road, because back in the 1920s and 30s, it had a whole series of little cabin complexes. So the name sort of sometimes endures in just the road names, but that popularity, I guess that's why we called it commercial archaeology, because sometimes we were studying something that's already gone.
Elise mentioned that there was a very popular TV show in the 60s called Route 66.
Yep. And again, I think the song Route 66 came first. It was written by Bobby Troup, and I think that came out in the late 40s. And then the Route 66 TV show with the two guys in their Corvette driving across the country, that's in the 1950s to around 1960. But Route 66 popularity continues to just amaze me.
Yeah, there's a follow-up from Elise. Are there any drive-ins left that have the waitresses on roller skates and that you can still eat in your car?
Not on roller skates, but the Sonic drive-in chain is the one that survives with the call-up window where you drive up and they bring your stuff out on the tray. And that's very active. It's headquartered out of Oklahoma City. They probably have almost 1,000 installations around the country. And so they're the last of the drive-ins that have car hop service, not on roller skates though.
And they so happen to have one at each of the schools our daughters go to, and that is the only time we have Sonic is when we are visiting our kids. So
Yeah,
if there are any more questions, please type them into the chat box. I find the whole thing really interesting. You know, for me and my husband, we sort of got a little bit more interested in Route 66 when they made the Disney Pixar made the film Cars,
Yep.
because it's all about, you know, Route 66, even though they don't necessarily say that. So what other films or TV shows have helped with the resurgence of the highway, do you think?
Well, it's a good question. Film and the story of the highway, because it's used as a backdrop of things, but you know, it's part of Steinbeck's authorship. You know, that great American hardship story. They're on Route 66 going west. So it's written into American literature. Even Nabokov's Lolita is a road trip story when you start to examine it from another possibility of what it tells as a story. So, you know, it's kind of ingrained in mid-century storytelling in America that the automobile trip is the way to go. You know, in the 19th century, there were train trips and going on the Great Excursion. In the 20th century, we got in our cars. So it's kind of a rite of passage to travel that way. And I don't have off the top of my head the best films of that era.
Well, I think Laura said Thelma and Louise.
Yeah, it's certainly a road trip. I'm not sure about that ending, but it is a road trip story, that's for sure.
Mike, what got you interested in this kind of architecture?
Oh, thanks. That's a good question. Ironically, I was living in New York City and I was going to graduate school at Columbia University, and it was the second annual meeting of the Society for Commercial Archaeology was at Columbia University when I was a student. So I went to the meeting, met the people who were doing this, and I thought, this is really interesting. I love roadside. I love to travel. I love to drive and, you know, cross country. And I spent 5 years working where I traveled a lot. And so I thought this is a group for me. So I joined the group, and immediately it was something I felt fun with as a storytelling, as an historian. So I was very active with that organization. And over 10 years, I moved up the chain to become president of the SCA. And then I was the guy who put together the Dearborn Conference in 1988, where we really got great national press. I was in the New York Times pictured with that. I was on ABC National News as this group advocating for the history of roadside architecture as part of the story of America. So it was a big part of my personal enthusiasm in the 1980s. And about every decade, I change my personal enthusiasm and pick up a new topic. But That was a really great decade of my life when I was championing rediscovering something. And it's fun to discover. I think discovery is one of the great human engagement things that you do, is finding out new things. And it can be discovery of, the explorer, or it can be discovery from the history side point of finding the new about the old. And that really is a part of the fun for me. I was also a postcard collector. I got into that at that time. So it's another way to get the artifacts that told the story. So it all came together, I think, fairly well for me.
Eileen wants to know if you're planning on having a role in the 100th anniversary of Route 66.
I'm not officially on the Bicentennial Commission, but I know several of the members, and I know the leadership at the National Park Service who are in charge of that effort. So I kind of have a peripheral role in that, and plenty of knowledge. And in fact, I have a lot of personal documents of buildings in Illinois that were on early Route 66 that I documented before they were demolished. So I actually have a kind of a rare collection of Route 66 archives of my own that probably precede most other people's awareness of this, because I was started collecting this stuff before others were doing so. But it's okay. I don't need to be on every commission anymore. I got plenty of opportunities to do things. And but there's a great enthusiasm for this topic.
Have you actually driven from one end to the other of Route 66, regardless of where you think it starts?
No, I've not driven every part of it. I've probably driven everything on the east from Oklahoma to the Midwest. And in the West, I've driven part of it in New Mexico and part of it in California, but I've never done all of it across the country as one single visit, no.
When you were with us, I guess back maybe over the summer, and you were talking about Frank Lloyd Wright for us. And did he take Route 66 when he went to?
Absolutely. And he was a great enthusiast for the automobile. And every time he bought a new car, and he did that fairly frequently, he was into cars, he would have it painted Cherokee red because that was his favorite color. So he had to have all his cars a certain color. But yeah, his group would travel from Wisconsin out to basically the Scottsdale area for their winter headquarters. And he took Route 66 many times. And in fact, one of his trips, he came down to Springfield on Route 66 in the 1930s, and he stopped in the Dana house to see Mrs. Dana and visit his design there. And it's kind of one of the few, it's the only document we have of Frank Lloyd Wright at the Dana Thomas house, is from his visit in 1930s.
Interesting. Well, yeah. Mike's actual presentation about Frank Lloyd Wright's Dana Thomas house is on the JCC Chicago YouTube page. So you can go back and check that out and see what else Mike has to offer. I don't believe that we have any more questions. So I would like to say thank you to everyone for joining us. Mike, this was once again very informative, and my team and I really appreciate your continued support of these programs. Sure. If you're interested in more really great learning opportunities, please visit our website, jccchicago.org. Next week, we'll be visiting Ebsworth Park, another of Frank Lloyd Wright's properties, and we will also be visiting the synagogues of the west side of Chicago. So if you check out our website, again, jccchicago.org, that's where you'll find all the information. Thank you again, Mike, so much, and everyone, please stay well and take care.
All right, thank you much.